October 1945. Hameln Prison, British-occupied Germany. A 22-year-old woman stands on a scaffold, her hands bound. Witnesses in the room later say she looks almost bored. When the executioner tells her to hurry, she reportedly replies with a single word, "Schnell." Quick. Minutes later, Irma Grese is dead, the youngest woman executed under British law in the 20th century. At Auschwitz, prisoners called her the hyena. At Bergen-Belsen, survivors described a young woman in polished boots who carried a whip braided from cellophane, who seemed to enjoy her work in ways that unsettled even other guards. Witnesses at her trial accused her of routinely beating prisoners and of taking part in selections that sent people to the gas chambers. But here is the part of her story most documentaries skip. 2 years before any of that, Irma Grese was a teenage girl standing in an employment office, filling out an application to become a nurse, and getting turned away. She tried again. Turned away again. She worked farms, dairies, and shops for a wage that barely covered rent, drifting through a series of jobs that led nowhere. And then, almost as if the machinery of the Nazi state had been waiting for exactly this kind of failure, she was funneled, not forced, though she later claimed she was, into the SS. This is not just the story of one notorious camp guard. It's the story of a recruitment system that was built, deliberately, to catch young women like her. Irma Ida Ilse Grese was born on October 7, 1923, in the small village of Rechen, in the rural Mecklenburg region of northern Germany. Her father, Alfred Grese, worked as a dairyman, a respectable but unglamorous trade in a farming community that had been battered by Germany's economic collapse after the First World War. Her mother, Berta, raised Irma and her 4 siblings in a household that, by most accounts, was strict, modest, and unremarkable. Then, when Irma was about 12 or 13 years old, tragedy struck. Her mother discovered that Alfred was having an affair with the daughter of a local pub owner. Devastated, Berta took her own life by drinking hydrochloric acid. It's tempting, in hindsight, to treat this as the single explanatory trauma of Irma Grese's life, the origin point that turns a normal child into a monster. Serious historians resist that kind of tidy psychology. Millions of German children grew up in broken, grieving, and economically desperate households in the 1930s without becoming camp guards. What we can say with more confidence is narrower and more useful. The loss of her mother left a teenage girl with less supervision, less structure, and, in a household now run by a grieving, remarried father, fewer people paying close attention to which direction her life was heading. That mattered, because Germany in the mid-1930s had built an entire apparatus specifically designed to catch drifting teenagers and pull them into its orbit. By the time she was a young teenager, Irma had become deeply involved in the Bund Deutscher Mädel, the League of German Girls, the female wing of the Hitler Youth. Membership had been compulsory for German girls since 1936, but for Irma it appears to have gone well beyond the mandatory minimum. Her father reportedly disapproved of how consumed she became by it, and some accounts describe friction at home over her fixation on the organization's uniforms, rallies, and ideology. This is worth pausing on, because the League of German Girls was not simply a youth club. It was a pipeline. It taught physical fitness, domestic skills, and unwavering loyalty to the regime, and it was explicitly structured to funnel girls toward specific roles the Nazi state needed filled: mothers of the next generation, agricultural laborers, factory workers, and, increasingly, as the 1930s wore into war, administrative and paramilitary functionaries. For a girl like Irma, average academically, without money for further schooling, alienated at home, the League offered something genuinely appealing: structure, belonging, and a sense that she mattered to something larger than her small village. Historians of the Hitler Youth movement have long noted how effectively it exploited exactly this kind of social and emotional vacancy. It didn't need to indoctrinate happy, secure children. It thrived on reaching the ones who had nowhere else to go. Grese left school in 1938, at around age 14, with poor academic results behind her. Her formal education was finished. Her working life was about to begin, and it would not go the way she hoped. What Grese wanted, by her own account, was to become a nurse. It's a detail that surprises people, given what she later became, but nursing was one of the few respected professional paths open to a working-class German girl at the time, and it fit the ideal the regime itself was promoting: women in service to the health and strength of the nation. Her first attempt at that path came through farm and shop work, 6 months on agricultural labor, 6 months in a shop, the kind of interim jobs a 14-year-old took while waiting to be old enough for anything more formal. At 15, she got her opening, a position at the Hohenlichen Sanatorium, a hospital that treated SS personnel, where she worked as an assistant nurse under the sanatorium's director, the SS physician Karl Gebhardt. For 2 years, Grese worked there, hoping it would lead to a real nursing apprenticeship. It didn't. In 1941, she was let go, by most accounts because she wasn't meeting the standards required of a trainee. She would later tell a very different story at her war crimes trial, that she'd been blocked from nursing by Germany's compulsory labor service system, the Reichsarbeitsdienst, not because she'd failed to make the cut. It was a self-serving account, delivered by a defendant trying to portray herself as someone who'd been pushed into every step of her life rather than one who chose it. The documented record suggests the truth is less flattering to her, she simply wasn't good enough at the job to keep it. Either way, the door closed. Gebhardt, who apparently felt some sympathy for her, gave her a contact at a concentration camp that was, at the time, just another employer looking for staff, Ravensbrück, a camp built specifically to hold female prisoners. Grese went to inquire about a position there, and was turned away a second time. She was told to come back once she turned 18, still 6 months off. She didn't return on schedule. Instead, she took a job at a dairy farm, where she worked from March 1941 to June 1942. 2 rejections. A dead-end stint in a shop. Farm labor for subsistence wages. By 19, Irma Grese had applied for the one profession she actually wanted and been refused twice. She had no other clear path forward, no savings, no advanced schooling, and a home life she wasn't eager to return to. This is the exact profile that Germany's wartime labor system was engineered to catch. To understand what happened next, you need to understand 2 overlapping systems the Nazi state had built by 1942. The first was the Reichsarbeitsdienst, the Reich Labor Service, which by law directed young Germans, including unmarried women under 25, into whatever jobs the state decided the country needed. Officially, the Arbeitsamt, or labor exchange, controlled placement. In practice, this meant an 18 or 19-year-old woman without a trade had very little say in where she ended up. If the regime needed dairy workers, she became a dairy worker. If it needed camp staff, she could be steered there instead. The second system was the SS's own recruitment machine for the Aufseherinnen, the female concentration camp guard corps. As the camp network expanded rapidly through 1942, with Ravensbrück serving as the central training site for female guards, the SS needed a constant supply of new personnel. And crucially, this was not a role that required education, family connections, or ideological credentials beyond basic loyalty. It required almost nothing except a willingness to show up. No academic qualifications were checked. No psychological screening existed in any meaningful sense. The pay was better than dairy or shop work. The job came with a uniform, a title, and, for a woman who had spent years being told no, the sudden experience of being told yes, and of having authority over other human beings for the first time in her life. Historians who study the SS's female guard corps have noted a recurring pattern in their backgrounds: overwhelmingly working-class origins, minimal education, and employment histories marked by exactly the kind of instability Grese displayed. This wasn't recruitment by accident. Camps needed cheap, unskilled labor that could be trained fast, paid little, and controlled easily, and the labor allocation system fed them a steady stream of exactly that kind of applicant, whether or not any individual woman actively sought the job. Grese later testified that in July 1942 she tried a third time to become a nurse, and that the labor exchange refused her again and assigned her to Ravensbrück instead, against her protests, in her telling. But the fuller documented record complicates that story considerably. She had already sought out a Ravensbrück contact of her own accord the year before. When she reapplied in mid-1942, records suggest she was accepted as a trainee guard on her own initiative, not marched there against her will by a bureaucrat with a clipboard. That distinction matters enormously to how we understand her, and to the whole nurse-turned-camp guard narrative. It wasn't simply that the system rejected her from a respectable job and dumped her into an atrocity by administrative accident, though that outer framework is real and well documented. It's that a young woman who had been repeatedly rejected, who had no other prospects, actively pursued the one door that was open to her, and that door happened to lead into one of the most murderous institutions in human history. The system didn't need to force her. It only needed to be the only option left standing. In July 1942, 18-year-old Irma Grese entered Ravensbrück as a guard trainee. The training program lasted a matter of weeks, sources describe it as roughly 3 weeks, after which she was given the title of Officerin, female SS overseer, and put to work supervising prisoners. Consider what that means. A teenager who 2 months earlier had been rejected from a nursing apprenticeship for not meeting basic standards was now, after a training course shorter than a modern job orientation, granted legal authority over the lives of imprisoned women. She earned 54 Reichsmarks a month, modest, but more reliable than casual farm labor, and by all accounts, she was considered to excel at the role during her 7 months there. It's worth sitting with that word, excel. The qualities that had made her unsuited for nursing, limited patience, limited formal discipline, temperament some who knew her described as harsh, apparently made her well suited to a job that rewarded control, intimidation, and the willingness to enforce brutal rules without hesitation. A system that had no use for her in a caregiving profession found immediate use for her in one built on domination. In March 1943, after 7 months at Ravensbrück, Grese was transferred to the camp that would define her reputation, Auschwitz-Birkenau. At Auschwitz-Birkenau, Grese rose quickly through the ranks of the female guard hierarchy, eventually reaching the position of Oberofficerin, senior SS supervisor, the second highest rank held by any woman at the camp. At various points she oversaw tens of thousands of female prisoners. Survivor testimony from her eventual war crimes trial painted a portrait of calculated cruelty. Prisoners accused her of beating inmates with a riding whip or rubber truncheon, of prolonging brutal roll calls for hours in freezing conditions, and of taking an active role alongside the camp physician Joseph Mengele in selections, the process that determined who would be sent to forced labor and who would be sent directly to the gas chambers. Survivors described physical violence, public humiliation, and abuse that went well beyond what even her SS superiors required of her. In January 1945, as Soviet forces advanced and Auschwitz was evacuated, Grese moved back to Ravensbrück, then in March 1945 was transferred again, this time to Bergen-Belsen, a camp that by the war's final months had descended into catastrophic overcrowding, starvation, and disease. It was there, 3 weeks later, that British forces liberated the camp on April 15, 1945, and captured Grese along with the SS personnel who hadn't managed to flee. At the Belsen trial that followed, Grese took the stand in her own defense on November 1, 1945, giving the account of a young woman who had been steered by forces beyond her control at every stage, rejected from nursing, compelled by labor authorities, unable to say no. It was a narrative built, understandably, to minimize her own agency in front of a military tribunal that held her life in its hands. The tribunal wasn't persuaded. Weighed against extensive eyewitness testimony from camp survivors describing sustained, personal, and often gratuitous violence, her account of powerlessness did not hold up. On November 17, 1945, Irma Grese was convicted of war crimes and crimes against humanity and sentenced to death. She was hanged on December 13, 1945, at Hameln Prison, 22 years old. It's tempting to tell this story as a simple morality tale, a rejected girl, pushed by circumstance, becomes a monster. That version is comforting, because it keeps the horror contained to one unlucky, damaged individual. The more uncomfortable truth is structural. Nazi Germany built overlapping systems, compulsory labor allocation, an expanding camp network hungry for cheap and easily trained staff, and a youth movement that had already primed a generation of undereducated, economically stranded young women to seek meaning through obedience and uniformed authority. Irma Grese wasn't randomly swept into that machinery. She was exactly the kind of applicant it was built to receive, young, poor, twice rejected, and desperate enough to walk through the one door still open to her. Understanding that doesn't excuse what she did in Auschwitz's roll call yards and gas chamber selection lines. She made choices there that many other guards, in the same system, chose not to make. But it does explain something darker and more important than her individual cruelty, how a state can build a pipeline that turns ordinary failure and ordinary desperation into extraordinary atrocity, and how many of the people who walked into that pipeline never set out to become monsters at all. They set out, simply, to get a job.